Hey, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of AngularAir. I am your host, Justin, and on today's episode, we are going to get an intro to NativeScript. Super looking forward to this. I think we've talked about that a long time ago, so it'll be nice to get a new refresher update with all the latest. So let's say hi to our panelists, then we'll meet our guest, and then we'll get into the content as usual. Joining us today, we've got Mike, who just showed up. Mike, how's it going?
Not too bad. I've been here for a long time. You just didn't let me in the show. At least that's the story I'm going to stick with.
All right.
Even though
been in the green room hanging out, right?
Absolutely.
A wizard is never late.
I was hanging out backstage, talking to your people. It was cool hanging out. So happy to be here.
Cool. Nice. Bonnie's with us. Bonnie, how's it going?
Great. Happy Friday. Very excited to be here. Very excited about our guests tonight, but I'm not going to spoil it.
Nice.
Not yet.
I was deciding, do I call on you next or not? But you came through. That's nice.
I got this.
Would have been fine too, by the way. Alyssa's with us. Alyssa, how's it going?
Hello. So excited to be here and love the topic. Woo.
Nice. And we've got a guest panelist today. Nathan's joining us. Nathan, how's it going?
Awesome. Going very well. Thanks for having me. It's always nice to join everyone at AngularAir. It's been a long time since I've seen some folks, so it's good to see everyone.
It's always good to see you.
Good.
Maybe we should let Nathan, because Nathan knows this guest. Maybe we should let Nathan tell us about.
Sure. So yeah, William Juan is the special guest today, and he is someone who's been involved with Angular for a good long while, and he's also been doing some really fun stuff with NativeScript. He also does some fun stuff with Ionic, and he's just all around like really sharp developer, a lot of fun, really creative. So it's quite an honor to have him here with us. So William, welcome. And is there anything you want to share about kind of perhaps where you are and what you do?
Can I, because I want to jump in and add something too, because he's been on Angular Nation quite a bit lately. And I want to say he is like the nicest. He's like helping people so much. And he's amazing too. So I haven't known him nearly as long as you have, but I'm very impressed with him. Let's not get mushy or anything. Sorry, William, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Nathan and Bonnie. Yeah, I'm joining from Indonesia.
It's late at night. Thank you very much because I know that the time zones don't add up at all. So you had to do what is it, like 2 o'clock in the morning where you're at?
No, it's not that bad. It's 11.
Okay. Oh, that's not so bad. Okay, well, still, thank you for staying up late for us. We appreciate you. Yeah,
of course. Thanks for having me.
William, and for your day work, you currently have a job there. Is it working with Angular?
Yeah, I do contract work doing NativeScript. Right
and would you say that your work predominantly is NativeScript mixed with Angular? Does it mix with anything else? And do you do things, outside of NativeScript as well?
Right now, the main project is NativeScript Angular with NX and XPlat. I think you probably have seen this project, Nathan.
Nathan, have you heard of XPlat?
I don't know about that one. No, that's pretty exciting, William. So I was kind of curious. I've actually always been curious what maybe had led you into Angular. And or JavaScript. I don't know which came first. Did you get into JavaScript development sometime before that led you into Angular? Did Angular get you into JavaScript development? Perhaps everyone would love to hear a little bit of your story there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I started with Angular. My first introduction to web was Angular. So I interned for a startup where they did hybrid mobile development, but NativeScript wasn't a thing back then. So we used Ionic, and then we had a lot of native API requirements. So we were dealing with hardwares through BLE, so through Bluetooth. And then at that time, it was really difficult to do that part of it in Ionic, and then that's when NativeScript came out. So that's when I made the switch to NativeScript. And since both platforms did support Angular, so I kind of just learned Angular, even though I switched between frameworks.
So you were sort of introduced to Angular through Ionic, or used them in concert at the time. And of course, for those that don't know, Ionic working with Angular in the beginning, and now it works with all the frameworks. But like this time span of that project, would you say, was it 2 or 3 years working, kind of in hybrid development?
Yeah, I would say my last 4 to 5 years was hybrid development. So it was mostly NativeScript on different projects.
Now, have you had a chance to try of lately, just out of curiosity, Capacitor, which is probably a nice enhancement from what you may have experienced previously?
Yes, I did. I did get a chance to work with Ionic with Capacitor as well, and then for work, and then I also got to play around with that when NativeScript came out with their Capacitor plugin. So I get to play with both technologies on the same project, which was pretty exciting.
That is, like, especially in the realm of Bluetooth LT, it's possible that some of the challenges you encountered with that, you probably could use some of those integrations today to perhaps get at what you were, working with then. So yeah, it's an interesting topic just in general. I'm sort of curious also with Angular specifically, is there something that you saw in Angular early on that kind of perked your interest, right off the bat? Is there something in particular with Angular that you fell in love with, which in maybe is the reason why you have stuck with Angular, all these years?
I think when I first started, I didn't really know any other framework, so I only knew Angular, and I thought Angular was the whole thing. Like I didn't know other frameworks existed. But since I've been developing with Angular for a while, it just kind of feels natural, and then it feels really easy when jumping between projects. Because sometimes I would work on 3 different projects, and when all of them are in an Angular workspace sort of setup, it's really easy to transition because I feel like everything looks almost identical, like structure-wise, like
a lot of consistency. Yeah.
Right.
Speaking
and I feel
of
like
easy, you have something to show us?
Yeah, I do. I prepared a few slides.
Fun.
I love the visuals because I think it gets hard to follow the conversation sometimes when we're just talking, but it's nice to have something kind of look at while we're talking.
Yeah, I think while you're preparing the slides, William, I think just to second your notion on, the aspect of Angular and consistency, I think that's always one sense of it that I've always loved too. I think the best practice guide that's been out there that I know, I think John Papa had a hand in and really helped establish a nice consistency of working with the framework, I think really has stood its test of time and does help. I think it's really nice to approach code when there is a consistent way to work with it, and I think the only relative thing you can compare that with is perhaps the years of jQuery for those who had done those back in the day, and that you could really go at that so many different ways, which was nice on one hand, but then the other hand at scale is that when you are moving through projects, that inconsistency can really cause headache and problems. So yeah, the consistency with Angular is super nice.
Yeah, and especially even for large code bases, it's really easy to navigate those structure if it's consistent through various different projects.
Absolutely.
I always like the fact too that Angular has the dependency injection. I think that's always a big thing that kind of stands out as a differentiator, and especially when you get into multiple projects and have to manage code, and the ability to have dependency injection is like something that kind of keeps you around.
I think it's a great segue into William perhaps your slides here, I think using Angular with NativeScript is such a natural fit because of dependency injection, because DI does make cross-platform runtime configuration really nice and flexible. So yeah, I mean, perhaps that sets the stage for some of the things you'll talk about here, William, with, just NativeScript with Angular in general.
Yeah. So this is going to be a really high-level intro to NativeScript. I'm not going to get into as much detail as in like a lot of the, but this is like a preview of what you can actually do with NativeScript and what fancy things that NativeScript offers. So let me start with what is NativeScript. So this is something I pulled straight from the NativeScript website. It's an open source framework for building native apps. So think Ionic, React Native, Flutter. So NativeScript is similar to those to an extent. And then what makes it interesting is what makes NativeScript different compared to other frameworks. Firstly, NativeScript is not tied to a specific framework, and you could use all these different frameworks with NativeScript to build mobile apps. So if you know JavaScript, TypeScript, you could use straight up JavaScript and TypeScript with NativeScript. If you know Angular, Vue, React, or Svelte, you can use those as well. So if you know how to build web apps with any of these frameworks, then you could use that same knowledge to build a mobile app using NativeScript. One aspect of NativeScript that makes it really powerful is its native API access. So you have direct native API access straight from JavaScript. So this code snippet here is in TypeScript and is valid NativeScript code. So when using NativeScript, you could access any of the native APIs, exposed or not exposed through the NativeScript layer directly. So the snippet is how you would access the device's battery level on both iOS and Android. Let's see how NativeScript's implementation differs from their native implementations. So the code above is Objective-C, and the one below it is how you would use it in a NativeScript app. So it's essentially the same code. It's just with a slightly different syntax. You have all the same variable names and all that. It's just structured in a little different way. And this applies to any other Objective-C code that you want to translate into NativeScript. And then on the Android side, so this is what it looks like comparing the Java implementation to NativeScript, JavaScript, or TypeScript. Another big thing with
if I could interject for a moment, William, go back to the previous slide, and I think it's worth noting that probably whenever you see something like this, I think coming from web development, this looks terrifying, right? Because I think for sure, like native APIs sound like something that are kind of beyond the pale. And it almost sounds like something you don't want to deal with, I think, coming from web. And so I think sometimes there's sort of an approach or a mentality around web development that you want to be protected from these type of APIs, that, almost don't want to know about them, just give them to me in a way that, I don't have to think about them. And I think that is a common thread often when you see something like this, it's like, oh, hey, I was actually kind of appreciating the fact I didn't have to think about things like that. And I think it's always important to put this up against practical day-to-day work, because in practical day-to-day work, it's more about getting things done. And when you're trying to get something done, if you don't have access to something right away, it's a hindrance. It's actually going to slow your development process. It's also going to increase frustration on a daily basis because you don't have access to something. So you're usually having to go and find, well, what can give me access to this? Is this stack that I'm working in, does it provide some mechanism to where I can get at that thing? That means you have to go and, find the docs with that thing that you're working on and find the mechanism to get at that, whether it's provided automatically or whether it's something that you're going to have to, work in to try to get at yourself. So I think for any web developers that get into this kind of development or who are curious and see stuff like this, it's always worth putting this up against the daily grind, if you will, the day-to-day work. And really what NativeScript is about making that more liberating and just allowing you to get at the things that you ordinarily might not be able to get at right away. You might have to go through other mechanisms, most often through a plugin of some sort. And plugins are great to some degree, but certainly at scale, when you're having to deal with a plugin for trivial things on a daily basis for any errata, when you're dealing with device APIs, it is and can be painful. So I just want to mention that while you're on that slide, because I think the first reaction anytime someone sees that who has never dealt with native APIs before and is coming from strictly a web background is probably quite a bit of fright, and I think that's understandable for sure.
I can't let you slide, Nathan. You said you have to do these things that you don't want to have to think about, and I completely agree. I love to be able to program without having to think at all.
That's a common thread today,
isn't it?
Hey guys, let's let William finish his slides and then we'll go, because I think we have time at the end too for more discussion, don't we, William? But I think he was going to show us his intro, and then he had something else cool that he was going to show us too. So I don't want to take up too much time because I want to see what he's got for us.
I have an applicable question from chat, though, that applies directly to this slide. Timothy asked whether or not you get code completion as you're accessing these OS-specific APIs. So as you're developing and writing code like this, are you getting any type of code completion or IntelliSense as you write this code?
Yeah, so great question. And yes, Bonnie, we'll move on and let William finish here. Very relative question in the sense of this slide, yes. So NativeScript was one of the early frameworks that started dealing with TypeScript when TypeScript was introduced, I don't know, 2015, 2016, around that time maybe. But it was originally written in TypeScript. So one of the key aspects of NativeScript is that it's TypeScript based. So everything had to be strong type. That was sort of an important piece to its design, since all native platform APIs you deal with are often strongly typed languages as well. So you really couldn't get a really high fidelity to native API without strong typings. And so, yeah, all this is strong typed and IntelliSense. And sorry for interrupting, William.
No worries. And going off of what Nathan said, with this native API access, the developers are also given the option of implementing stuff themselves. So say iOS 14 came out with a new feature. They don't have to wait for the NativeScript team to implement it in NativeScript core. They could access them directly whenever it's available on their platform.
We'll touch on detail on why and how that is later or in a moment.
Yeah. So moving on to code sharing. So one of the nice things about cross-platform development is you get to share code between Android and iOS. But with tools like NX, XSplit, and Learner, you can also share them with web apps and other kinds of apps within the same workspace. So the setup allows you to maximize the amount of code that you can reuse. In the context of Angular, this usually includes services, interceptors, directives, pipes, basically anything that would be platform agnostic. Even animations could potentially be shared. And then let me show you an example of how you could reuse your Angular knowledge when building a NativeScript app. This is a snapshot of an app I did for a YouTube series I'm doing, where I build out UIs using NativeScript and Angular. I'll show you a few code snippets just for an example, to create the bottom sheet on the screenshot on the far right of this. So starting with the folder structure. So let's say we're in a NativeScript project. This folder structure should be familiar. It's a regular Angular component file structure. It has a TypeScript file, a template, and then a style sheet. Nothing NativeScript specific here. And then nothing special here as well. Just a regular Angular component with the decorator, and then no difference to what you would see in a web Angular project. So if you were implementing that bottom sheet in a web project, you would most likely end up with a code similar to this for the bottom sheet. You have a few divs, p tags, and then a few span tags. So on a NativeScript app, it still has a similar structure, but instead of using divs and spans, you would use NativeScript specific layouts and components, which work similar to their web counterparts. So a grid layout works very similar to how CSS grids work, just with a slightly different syntax. And then labels are similar to span tags.
Can you go back to that real quick?
Yeah.
So just to be clear, because we talked about some OS specific differences, what you have here with this HTML, is that specific for one particular OS, or is that same markup used for both mobile OSs?
For both Android and iOS. You do have an option to split those into two different ones, though, if you do need platform-specific templates.
That's awesome, though, that you can potentially theoretically use the same markup to cover both operating systems. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So like the labels, those translate to native components on the iOS side. I think it translates to a UI label on the iOS side, and then it converts to the Android equivalent of that when it's run on Android.
So for someone who's totally used to web development only, when is a use case you would need to split out and have two separate templates?
Between Android and iOS?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are certain functionalities that that might be a little different, like when you want to implement. So for, say, iOS has those notches that Android doesn't. So you might want some styling that are specific to those to accommodate for those differences. And you can do it in a number of different ways. I don't know if you have a specific example, Nathan.
I was going to mention probably more along the lines of navigation. There's quite a few paradigms on either that are inverse, like sometimes bottom navigations are actually naturally on the top on Android, but they're on the bottom on iOS. And just given different apps, maybe the particular paradigm wants to always fix it to the top, for instance. So maybe you want to tweak the way that one platform deals with that kind of against its default, but you want it to kind of do that for your particular app. So you kind of have that flexibility to do customizations where the platform perhaps doesn't fit your exact need.
That sounds so cool and really powerful. That's awesome.
Yeah, it does give you a lot of control over all those details. And then if you look at the code side by side, you see that, like as I mentioned previously, the structure is almost identical. And if you see the Angular specific parts are also identical. So you see how the binding works. You can do the square brackets to do the one-way binding, and then the square brackets and parentheses for two-way binding. So all those work identical to web.
Perhaps on that slide, before you leave that one, I think there's a couple confusing surface level points from just looking at these two things in general. And something that's come up several times over the years in this topic in general is, why do you have to have a separate template at all? If NativeScript provides cross-platform, why can't you take the template on the left for the web and just render it natively, on the particular device? And the answer is you actually can. There was an experimental thing that was done several years ago where it took divs and web markup and actually translated those to native components. The reason it really didn't go much further than an experiment is because of how much diversity there is in Web DOM markup. Web DOM markup has a lot of pretty wild concepts that don't have exact one-to-one comparisons to mobile, and so it was just cleaner. I mean, that the simple answer is it was just cleaner to have a separate template that was more concise and distilled down. It's probably not too hard for many web developers out there to imagine a template that they've come across that has divs under divs, some floated left, some floated right, some inline block, and all these pretty wild div nested structures. And so it was more just the thought that there could be a broad number of edge cases around taking DOM markup, and just trying to map out all the different edge cases would kind of be unrealistic. You could probably get pretty close, but hitting like 100% one-to-one would probably be not precise. And I think just the mere fact that you couldn't be 100% one-to-one precise with it is why. But in the end, if you wanted to do something like that, you could. You could take an aspect of it and say, we're going to deal with at least this aspect of it. And if your web template, has those, general rules in it, then it could work. So that potential is always there, I'd say.
I could see it actually going the other way too, where when I look at the NativeScript on the right, if I just start building components that have those selectors, right, of grid layout and content view, then I could build my Angular, template the same way the NativeScript template is. So I just have one template, and then, still implement them from the website in the same type of DOM structure, whatever DOM structure I need for those translations, right?
Yes, and that was part of this experiment years ago, as well as going the inverse way too. And yes, that does work. I think just from the mere basis that you probably want to have like slightly subtle different touches when it gets into the web is probably why that effort didn't exactly continue or evolve into something more concrete. But yeah, I think with any effort like that, when you're talking templating, there's always potential to take that further, and that's always there. It's definitely possible.
We should keep going with the slides, you guys.
Sorry, William, we interrupted you again.
No, that's fine, Nathan. Yeah, so that's a good point that Nathan made was. So that kind of transitions nicely to this as well. So we saw the web code and the NativeScript code, but if the whole point of having NativeScript apps inside like an NX workspace, and you want to get maximum code being shared between all the different platforms, so how would you do that? If we take the example of that bottom sheet, this is what it would look like in an NX workspace. If this is like a stripped down version of it. So you would have an XPlat folder with the web folder and then a NativeScript folder. And then you would have their respective HTMLs and their TypeScript files, and then a base component that those could extend. So so the HTML could be different than what we saw earlier. And then this would be what the TypeScript files would look like for an NX workspace. So you have the bottom sheet base on the left, and then you can implement all your platform agnostic logic in there. And then you would just have the web version and an NativeScript version of this extended, and then add any platform specific logic in their respective classes.
Do you have quite a few more slides, William?
Just a few more.
Okay, go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to ask, does it support anything like almost like the CLI build of the environment TS file, where you could potentially just swap out the HTML file at build time? And so you wouldn't have to have like a base component. You could just have one component, class file. Or are you kind of in this scenario where you have to do the base component sort of approach?
This is a great question, William. I can answer this one. Yes. So there was NativeScript schematics was a direction with code sharing that used file extensions. So like .tns, which kind of goes back a number of years. Interesting history, as Justin and I talked about this concept many years ago at ngconf. But .tns does work. I mean, when you do platform, difference in templates. The problem typically there comes down to Webpack maintenance, because anytime you start dealing with custom file extensions, you have to deal with loaders, custom loaders. And then if there are changes in the syntax, dealing with loaders, you got to deal with that. And then, of course, Angular, the more it's evolved, has gotten more precise, with the Ivy render and more strict. And so it really wants to analyze the templates as well, in the Angular compiler. And so really, like, you can go that approach with custom file extensions, but generally what it means is more maintenance that you have to keep up with in your own stack. And so what this direction takes is more a direction that's one-to-one. So letting the Angular compiler just take and consume something that is something it can understand without any custom magic Webpack stuff.
Nice.
Go ahead, William.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for that, Nathan. Okay, so where does JS and native API access can work in your favor? This is something that I think is not commonly discussed point when talking about hybrid apps. Most people often talk about the performance concerns because of adding a JS layer on top of the native code. And then if we're using Angular, you add another layer on top of the JavaScript layer. But this could also work in your favor. And I like to think of this more of as providing developers with plenty of options to choose from, and thus making the app benefit from the benefits of each layer. Let me give you an example of this. To more easily showcase this, I think, let's talk about this from a UI and animation standpoint. So since we can do CSS and JavaScript in your mobile app through NativeScript, that means you would have access to CSS animations to a certain extent, and a slightly different version of animations via JavaScript using NativeScript-specific animation APIs. So the code here is valid CSS keyframe animations that you could use in both a web project and a NativeScript project. So you could also chain animations in your JavaScript using promises, like you would in a regular web projects, which I think is really powerful, because you would be able to implement, to use your web knowledge for this aspect and then apply it to a NativeScript project. Since if you're using an Angular flavor of NativeScript, you could also leverage Angular animations in your mobile apps. Again, this is also valid Angular animation code for both a web and a NativeScript app. So you could essentially reuse the same Angular animation code block for both apps. Okay, just video load on your end. Okay. So this is a demo I put together that's exclusively using just Angular animations in NativeScript. So you have the stagger animations, and then you have the state change, and then you have the enter and leave animation. So you could do a lot with just Angular animations alone in a NativeScript app, which I think is pretty cool and powerful. With that, you could also, since NativeScript gives you direct native API access from the JavaScript layer, you could also do something like this. This is a demo I created a while back that uses this particular technique. So I use a gesture handler from the JavaScript side, and then use that to control the view's underlying layer, which gets calculated based on where your finger is. So being able to combine those gestures and then other events from the JavaScript side, and then tying that directly to the native APIs, lets you do all kinds of things like this, which wouldn't be possible without the native API access, or you wouldn't be able to do it as easily.
So would you be putting this animation code inside of that component class file? That's the native one, and then the corresponding markup in the HTML for that native one, and that would keep it separate from your web one?
That's a great
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So on that note, I was going to say that's a good opportunity to mention compositional things. I think with NativeScript, what really stands strong is compositional architecture. Just like when you get into what is it, inheritance or composition over inheritance? Is that the right framing? So, I think with NativeScript code, because it is kind of composed different bits of native API, you can put it directly in the component. You could create a clean isolation of utilities between where you engage with the native API and start composing those methods in where you want to call them. And that way you create kind of a nice, clean organizational structure around your architecture where you have clean lines between where you engage with device APIs and kind of how you mix it in with your code. So it does leave a lot to your own creativity on how you want to architect. And perhaps that's one of the, I think, more interesting aspects of watching and hearing from people who work with NativeScript and Angular and really any framework is kind of how and a lot of background comes into that. I'd say that's where the opinions start to flood in pretty heavily, because some people, may be really offended to put this kind of code in an Angular component, whereas others may just do it naturally. And so it just depends. There's the answer is really there is a lot of creativity behind how you can engage with it. But our standpoint and what we always encourage as a group with anyone who's working with NativeScript is create compositional lines just as you would with JavaScript development. And, the more you center yourself around JavaScript and realize you are working with JavaScript, deal with it just like JavaScript. So, create a composed method, and that's an iOS API that he's showing right there. So you can even create a .iOS and a .android file, and a .android file would deal with the Android animation API, for example. And your compositional method would actually exclude one or the other depending on the platform you're running on. Or you can do it conditionally. There's definitely a lot of ways you can attack it. And it's easy to be overwhelmed with the power because you're like, wow, whoa, like where, what should I even, how should I do this? And that's a common feeling for sure. There's a lot of power there. There's a lot of ways to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's like, for me, I'm thinking about not only the animations, but also things like device access, right? Or things where I don't have it in the web, but I have it in native. So how do I respond? Like, where does that go conceptually when building this stuff, right? A single component that needs to run in both environments.
That's a great question. That's probably more relative to kind of XPlat in general. I think kind of in scope of code sharing, a lot of ways to share code, like we talked about NativeScript schematics, custom file extensions, or like XPlat. I'd say the thing that's unique with XPlat is that it tries to organize the code in a consistent way. So just like Angular brings a lot of consistency to front end development, XPlat tries to bring some consistency to cross-platform development, and it does that with natural structures like folder organization. So it attempts to give you an organization where there's already clean lines between web and NativeScript, and so you kind of have a consistent way that you can approach and split those, where you know that one aspect of your code base is not going to bleed into the other. And then how you share those between the two is it's a matter of case by case. You can either use dependency injection to provide at the lowest layer, provide a singular API that you then configure per runtime. You could do it through just utility methods as well. So yeah, that's kind of why XPlat sort of served or was seeking to exist at that, I guess many years back now. Maybe it was 2017 or 2018. But the fact is that with cross-platform work, you can end up in quite a corner, and it's because anytime you're mixing JavaScript with cross-platform natures, you can run into just all sorts of stuff. And because of that, we wanted to develop on a basis, because we do a lot of cross-platform work in a realm of consistency in the same way that Angular brings consistency to projects. We want the same consistency with cross-platform work.
Nice.
Y'all keep forgetting about the
Nice.
slides.
Yeah, sorry, William. Went off on a tangent there.
No, that's
ahead.
fine.
Go ahead, William.
Yeah, and going off of what Nathan said, this could also, depending on the size of the code that ends up being on, like for a particular feature, you could even break this out as a separate plugin or a library that you could consume in your app. So there are really a lot of different ways you could use these. And then, so since we are able to use CSS and JavaScript animations in NativeScript, this also means that we can use third-party libraries. So you could use stuff like Animate CSS in NativeScript, which I thought was pretty cool. I didn't know that it was possible until I actually tried it, and a lot of it is actually excluding some elements that you can't really animate because it doesn't exist in NativeScript, but you can animate a lot of things from CSS, which exposes this that you could use third-party libraries like Animate Style, or even stuff like Pop Motion here to bring Spring animations that you would do in web to mobile just through the JavaScript layer. So this video on the right, this is using Pop Motion with the code on the left side in a NativeScript project, and you get basically everything Pop Motion offers in a NativeScript app. And also, since we can use iOS and Android specific features, we could also use iOS and Android third-party libraries such as Lottie, or some pretty cool ones like these. So any library that you see that exists for specifically iOS or Android, you could wrap that into a plugin and then consume it in your NativeScript app. So NativeScript can use libraries from all the different environments, especially if like Android and iOS, like these kinds of stuff are probably really hard to do on web, and then bringing it to the native platforms, converting it to actual Swift or Java code. You could directly use any existing third-party libraries for these. And okay, go ahead, Nathan.
Oh, I was just going to mention that I think always the slippery slope these days is say this is hard to do on web. Web is very capable. It probably, I would say what we're looking at there, you could probably pull off on web with web animations as well. I think more of the question comes down to ultimately where and what exactly you're integrating with. You know, when it comes down, a lot of people asked the kind of common question, which is, why should I use, you know, something like NativeScript, or, you know, should I just build it all in web? And the answer is, it's not so one-to-one. Unfortunately, I mean, I wish there was an easy answer there, but there really is not. It just depends on kind of all the nuances you're working with, what you're dealing with. You know, like a good example might be probably one of the better examples, I'd say, when you're talking about UI layer stuff, whether you want to have your users interact in a DOM on a device versus use the native view on a device. One of the better aspects might be 3D. So like we did a integration with like NFTs recently that were 3D, and OC Fortune has done some work on 3D libraries and OpenGL on iOS and Android, and it provides the same like Canvas APIs that you deal with on the web for ease of use. But when you try to interact with those same things in a web view on the device, it didn't give quite the feel. It just didn't quite have that interactive feel that everyone was wanting. And so that's a good example where, you know, when you're in that situation, what do? You know, I mean, are there things that could be done to improve it? There might be subtle things, and there have been subtle things that were attempted, but nothing quite gave it that feel like we could get using OpenGL on the device directly, not through a an intermediate view like a web view. So those are examples, and that's a nuanced case. So it certainly depends. And I think what's also hard to understand for web developers when they approach something or hear of something like NativeScript is even the concept that there is such a thing as a native view layer. I think that's even sort of a foreign concept to many at first, for sure. That web is sort of a feature and an aspect that's on the device, but the device itself, has its own language to deal with everything from the hardware to what you're touching with your finger, and all of that stuff is sort of in the realm of what is often referred to as native API.
So when we're working with the NativeScript, is it not translating and running it on the mobile device in a web view? Does it actually how does that process come into play?
That's a great question. So yeah, this is often, I think, also a confusing point. It's even probably confusing to understand on the surface, especially for new developers that get into the field, just in general with web development when they get on mobile. But it has nothing to do with the web, actually. So when you're working with NativeScript and what you're seeing and touching on your finger has zero to do with the web DOM. Every single component that you're working with in the markup with NativeScript is actually the underlying native view language. So if you were to go back to that slide, William, for a second, the grid layout that was there, those components are actually the native view components on that device. So UI view, for instance, is kind of the base view on iOS. So that grid layout on the right there, when you interact with that on iOS, you're interacting with the UI view. And that's something you cannot render inside of a web browser. It's only possible to render directly on iOS, for example. On Android, you're dealing with an Android view.view, if you will, from the Android View package. And that's something that is available and compiled and delivered on Android devices through the Android APIs. So that's an important thing. And I think it's something that is often lost as well. And I would say it's very normal to be confused by that point, because it does seem confusing. How's that even possible? But NativeScript, what's happening when that grid layout actually gets rendered is it's creating a UI view, and it's just using the markup as a guide as to where to put things in the native view system as you normally would on that device. So if you weren't using NativeScript and you weren't writing grid layout there, you would probably be in Xcode and you would be creating a layout controller, whether it be through the IB inspector or UI builder there, and basically creating components with its own developer tools. And the thing that NativeScript tries to do is provide a consistent approach to doing that for iOS and Android, because if you even for a moment take a day and explore Xcode on its own and just maybe go through a tutorial and an example just creating an Xcode app, and then you try to do that same thing on Android, you will be, I think, pretty shocked to find out, perhaps, that both of those are very different. They are way different in the way that you deal with those view layers. And that's really the core of what NativeScript tries to solve as far as the view layer goes. NativeScript, I think it's important to note that it's not just about native view creation. You kind of get that for free because of what NativeScript's capable of, but it's actually not what it's about. NativeScript is much more about accessing the native API, and a side effect of that is the fact that you can deal with the native view language.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So, William, when you were doing your projects on, and you needed this solution for something, native as well as web, did you have things that drove you to deciding to do something like this where you need to utilize the native view rather than say just I'm going to build everything web and just do a web view and use tooling that just allows me to wrap that into an app that I can deploy as a native app? Like what was the differentiator, would you say, that made you decide that I need this native web view experience? Or I'm sorry, this native view experience rather than the web view. Because to me, it seems like, there's a lot of investment into deciding, like, if I want to go down this route and now I have to have, this multiple, classes, multiple templates and things like that. Like, what's the value for the return on it for me to just do that versus just say, I'm just going to keep building in web?
Yeah, for me personally, the main thing with why I wanted to have the NativeScript section of it is the native API access. Like Nathan said, that's where I think NativeScript really shines, and you don't get that as easily through a web view. So, like I mentioned earlier, places where I interact with hardware, with like via Bluetooth and all that. That's not necessarily view related, but that's where I think the NativeScript piece comes in, at least for me. If you have something else, Nathan.
Was there things like PhoneGap or things like that allows you to do that from a web view? Like, I'm wondering, that type of solution where, you need to get to the hardware, but you still want to run in a web view. Was that not an option, or is that a thing? Or is that a thing with NativeScript? Like, could you opt in NativeScript to just say, I want to use the APIs, but I want to render everything as a web view?
Ooh, I would love to answer this one. Yeah, the answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, there is a new view that's coming with NativeScript called Capacitor View, and you could actually just develop Ionic in with NativeScript, the inverse. So there's NativeScript for Capacitor, which lets you use NativeScript in a Capacitor project. The inverse is also coming, where you could use Capacitor inside NativeScript. What's the difference? There's not a huge difference, and that difference will actually get probably completely nullified in the coming months, if not by sometime next year. But the difference comes down to NativeScript CLI, because the NativeScript CLI has some abilities to it that are unique. And when you use, say, Capacitor inside NativeScript, you then kind of have all the power of the NativeScript CLI with you. When you use NativeScript inside Capacitor, you're using the Capacitor CLI. But there will be ways to engage with the NativeScript CLI, even if you're using the Capacitor CLI. So that line is going to be blurred more in time. But yes, there is a view that we have developed that's actually a capacitor. It's called Capacitor View, and it literally is Capacitor running inside of a NativeScript app. And so you could develop everything as you would today with Ionic, but you would have the added benefit of also mixing in NativeScript, just as what William's talking about, in exactly the same way. Now, you can do that today with NativeScript for Capacitor, but you're using the Capacitor CLI, and the dev experience is just a little different in how it integrates. But that line just will become blurred. Yeah, I guess it's worth noting that a web view, right, on each platform, there's only one way to engage with it. If you're going to host a web view on an app, on a device, each device has a native view that deals with it. And so in Capacitor, that's what they're dealing with. And in NativeScript, you deal with exactly the same thing. It's called a WK Web View. And a WK Web View is a native API that's provided by iOS to host web views. On Android, it is the WebKit API that's in the Android view stack. And there's no magic behind it. It's just an API that renders the web. And where you host that, what stack you use to do it, is not going to change that.
Yeah, because then I start thinking about, like, so what is it that I need that would define me needing to be outside of that web view, right? Like, because I even think like things like the animation you saw with the little pull spring sort of thing is something that we could do in the web, right? So we could build that. Now, I would say probably you look at it and go, okay, well, it's already there on native. So if I had just a solution to just use it, then I don't have to rebuild it in the web. But I could look at those sort of things and solve that and say, look, how can I keep my development experience always focused on one and maybe reduce that complexity from a development standpoint of that. So I was kind of trying to look at it and go, what's that defining thing that says now I need to, right? Maybe it's a game or you know, like you mentioned 3D or something else that defines that I'm going to be better being in the native view than a web view.
Yeah, I always try to come up with an easy answer for that, and it is tough. It's just a nuanced question, and I think anyone who's new coming in the field hates to hear that. You know, I think you're always looking for easy answers or clear, kind of black and white answers. And yeah, when you get into cross-platform, I think it's just there are nuances there, and as far as kind of taking if you build you've got a website today, you've got it all written, and you know, let's say you want to deliver that in a native view without doing anything extra. I would say that probably is a lot of what like cross platforms try to seek to do, but probably no one's done it like exactly one-to-one. I know a question came up on the board about Flutter, so it's probably worth mentioning. You know, Flutter takes a tack with a custom rendering engine. And the key difference, I think, that you want to talk about with platforms is, do you want to deal with the platform or do you want to deal with a proprietary piece of rendering tech that is unique to itself, right? And so I think what's the differentiating factor between NativeScript and Flutter is that NativeScript is a celebration of the platform. NativeScript seeks to be out of the way as much as possible in you dealing with the platform. So when you're dealing with iOS or Android, when you're working with NativeScript, you're dealing with iOS and Android. You're just using JavaScript as a way to touch it, but you're dealing with the exact same thing. That's why often with NativeScript, you say you can go to source documentation because you want to go to source documentation. That's the platform you're working with, right? When you're dealing with something like Flutter, you're dealing with a higher level rendering engine that is then put and hosted on that device, which means you now have a totally unique and proprietary set of documentation that you need to go learn. And if you want to know how to do something on that device, you can't go to the platform docs to do that. You're going to have to go through a different set of docs to understand how to get at that thing. So NativeScript seeks to kind of remove all of that and just let you work with the device as it was meant to be.
Nice. All right, well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Any last remaining things, William, on the NativeScript stuff that you wanted to get in there, or?
No, I think that's all I had.
Awesome. All right, well, let's do some picks if anybody has any picks. Actually, we can start with our panelists if anybody has any. No.
I'll start with something. Just
right.
Actually, someone mentioned it just yesterday. It's called Astro. Has anyone heard of Astro?
Just the dog from the Jetsons.
Like the dog? Yeah.
That's the dog from the Jetsons. Their logo might be different. No. It was just an interesting thing that was shared with me yesterday that I'm gonna have to look more into, and it's about a rendering engine. Is what it sounded like. And it's about taking like JavaScript and then rendering it. And it's different than a static site generator, but it actually would take a JavaScript based project and let the browser render it without JavaScript, but then let it be progressively enhanced. But it's uniquely different than static site generator. So just something interesting I heard that might be an interesting look. It's called Astro.
Do you have a link?
Nice.
I'm thinking
yeah.
searching for the term Astro might be a little bit
Yeah, that is broad, right? Let me see. Where can I put this as a public comments? Can I put it in public comments?
probably you can put it in private and Justin can share it.
There we go. Yeah, that's a YouTube video that goes into it. And again, no disclaimer there. I don't know much about it, but it did look interesting. So at a minimum, might just be an interesting look.
Cool. Cool. Any other panelists have any picks? No. All right, I have a pick. My pick is The Bad Batch, the Star Wars series on Disney Plus. There'll be a new episode today. So as soon as we're done here, and as soon as I'm done with work, I'll be go and check that out. Really great storytelling. I love it. So that's my pick. All right, William, do you have any picks you want to share? Or I mean, you shared all his content. We're good too. You don't have to have a pick, but if there's something you want to plug.
No, nothing from me.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, hey, Nathan, thanks a ton for coming on and being a guest panelist today. Really appreciate it. Always
Thanks for having
appreciate
me.
seeing you.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And William, thanks a ton
Thank you,
for
guys.
taking your time and sharing your content and helping educate us on NativeScript and all this stuff. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. All right. That's a wrap. Thanks, everyone.
Good to see
Catch you
everyone.
next time.
Thank you, William.
Take care. See ya.